I've got a few little housekeeping things I want to take care of first before we get started. And it's going to be, I have to say, it's going to be awfully tempting to bang this gavel at some point. So if any of the panelists like go on for a little too long, I'm just going to, do that. And I won't, actually. That was a joke. I'm sorry. Please silence your cell phones. That's the first little bit of housekeeping. Also, keep your cell phones out so that you can tweet about this. Take pictures, tweet about this, talk about what a great time you're having and how handsome your moderator is. If you do tweet, hashtag VA Bookfest or hashtag VA Book 2022. So I'd love to spread the word as much as we can. I do want to thank the event sponsor here, the Charlottesville Sister Cities Commission, in honor of Winneba, their sister city in Ghana. That is a sponsor of the event. We appreciate them putting their support toward this. Festival is free of charge. It is not free of cost. If you've been to events before, I'm sure you've heard that already. Please support festival programming with a donation by visiting vabook.org. Your support ensures that we may sustain this festival for many more years to come. I've been to the festival several times before. We've certainly missed it. I know everybody here in the community has missed it over the last couple of years being in person. Jane and her crew have done a great job of keeping it alive virtually. It is terrific to be back in person, even at a limited capacity here. Speaking of giving shout-outs toward Jane, do fill out program evaluations. You can complete those online, vabook.org/feedback, and you can also use the QR code on the back of your program. So do let folks know what's working and maybe what's not, but we hope you'll give some good feedback in those directions. A couple more things. COVID precautions. In order to keep all in the community safe as possible, please do keep your masks on at the event. You'll notice that the panelists do not have masks on. We did all take tests previously, as you've probably heard, and we have been cleared for the day. Finally, a great way to support the festival and the authors is through book sales. There's a table outside with the authors' books on it, and not only the authors for this panel, but also from the previous Crime Wave panels throughout the day. Please support your local author. Or not so local author. Yasmin is coming up from South Carolina, but has Northern Virginia roots, so she's sort of local, sort of not. Support your authors no matter what. Now, on to thrillers for a wild ride, our program today. I feel like I should say something like start your engines or, ready for rumble. Quick introduction of the panelists. Yasmin Angoe, author of Her Name is Night, is a first-generation Ghanaian American who grew up in two cultural worlds. She received the 2020 Eleanor Taylor Bland Award for Emerging Writers of Color from Sisters in Crime, of which she is a proud member, and I am too. Yasmin lives in South Carolina, as I said. S.A. Cosby, author of the New York Times bestseller Razorblade Tears, is an Anthony Award-winning writer from southeastern Virginia. His critically acclaimed Razorblade Tears and Blacktop Wasteland were both named New York Times notable books and named Best Book of the Year by NPR, The Guardian, and Library Journal, among many others. When not writing, he is an avid hiker and a chess player. And on the far end, Vera Kurian, author of Never Saw Me Coming, is a writer and scientist living in Washington, D.C. Her short fiction has been published in magazines such as Glimmer Train and The Pinch. She has a Ph.D. in social psychology, where she studied intergroup relations, ideology, and quantitative methods. I am Art Taylor, a professor at George Mason University, just up the road, and the author most recently of the story collection The Boy Detective and The Summer of '74 and Other Tales of Suspense. I don't know why I'm reading this. I should know it without having to read it. I've been fortunate to win some awards for my short fiction, including an Edgar Award a couple of years ago, and I say that as a segue to congratulating both Vera and Sean for their Edgar Award nominations this year. Those will be announced next month. Good luck ahead with all that. And Sean's also racking it up at the Thriller Award nominations too, so doing well.
I got 3.
Yeah.
So I don't know who I paid off inadvertently, but it's pretty cool.
It's a good place to be.
Yeah.
All right, so that said, I want to start off with some questions. Now, I have a confession. As much as I've talked about how much I love the Virginia Book Fest, I did not read the write-up for our own panel until a couple of days ago. It seems like it would be the first thing I did. I had delved into the novels first, came back to the write-up later, but I was impressed with how well whoever wrote up that description did, talking about the pain of losses and the fury of past wrongs, and characters bent on revenge, which finds a common ground with all the books that we're going to be discussing today. What struck me, however, before reading that description was how different each of the books was. And so I want to invite each of you, I know this is not a fun thing to do sometimes, but I want to invite each of you to introduce your book briefly. Tell us something about the genesis of the book as well, what got you into writing the story. And we'll start here. Yasmin.
Sorry, Yasmin. Okay, so my book, Her Name is Night, is about an assassin, Nina Knight, who works for an elite she's an elite assassin, and she works for this clandestine organization called the African Tribal Council. And while on a mission for them, she comes across one of the men who raised her Ghanaian village and killed her family and sold her into human trafficking. So she comes across them after like 17 years, and she has to make that decision whether she is going to go through with her mission or she is going to go on her own mission of revenge, and that is what she does.
Nice. Now, where did the idea for the story come from? What drove you in that direction?
I think I was mad at someone, and I was going through a divorce, and I wanted some revenge. A little bit of that. I was going through a whole bunch of different things at that time, and so I decided I was just going to kind of write through my emotions with a whole bunch of different themes, which I think we'll talk about later, that you see in the book. But yeah, I wanted to talk about my culture in a different way, and I wanted to like really write about a female who is in this space that you don't normally see females in this action-packed John Wick-esque kind of, which my friend here said, kind of John Wick-esque kind of position. And then not only that is she a woman, but she is a woman from like Ghana who, we never see that. So I kind of wanted to blend all of my favorite kind of things into this one story.
I teach Sue Grafton's A is for Alibi, and I think she wrote that as well, in part because of a divorce and started. So you've got a good career ahead of you there. I was also going to say, we met last night at the Crime Wave event last night, and afterwards we were chatting a little bit, and was saying how much I enjoyed the book, and I said it was a fun book. John Wick-esque. There's much in there. And then I thought about the human trafficking stuff that's in there, and I felt very self-conscious. I said, well, I don't mean fun, and then suddenly stumbled. It is, and this is one of the questions we'll get to later, it is a very entertaining book. It's also a heavy book in many cases. We'll talk about that soon. Sean?
Razorblade Tears is a story of two fathers, one black, one white, both ex-cons, Ike Randolph and Buddy Lee Jenkins, who have very little in common except that their sons, Isaiah and Derek, were married. And at the beginning of the book, their sons had been murdered. And so these two men of violence who did not accept their sons for who they were, who had quite a bit of prejudice and homophobia within their own heart, decide to investigate the crime when it seems like the police have lost interest. And so it's a path, they get set on a path of revenge, but also redemption. They're trying to do better for their sons in death than they did in life. And so these two men of violence wreak a path of bloody vengeance throughout southeastern Virginia, and including using a wood chipper.
Mm-hmm. And where'd the idea come from? Like, what prompted you to?
It came from two places. One, I have a really good friend of mine who is a writer and former, Todd Robinson. He used to publish a magazine called Thug Lit. Mm-hmm. And one day I was talking to him about the fact that we are getting older. And both of us, I don't want to speak for Todd, but I grew up kind of a roustabout, kind of a ruffian, and I've had a bar fight or two or three, and you get to a certain age where you realize that I have more yesterdays than I have tomorrows, and what does that mean, and what does that look like, and are there things that you wish you could change, and are there things that you wish you could get redemption for? So that was one part of it. The other part, I have a relative who came out a few years ago. He and I are about the same age, and so he came out to his parents, my aunt and uncle, and it didn't go very well. And so later on, I took him out for a beer, and we were talking, and he said two things that stuck with me for years when I started this book. One thing he said, He said, if I could do hair, if I could was a hairdresser, or I could lead a church choir, they wouldn't care if I was gay. Because in the Southern community, in my experience, if you have a skill like doing hair or you can play the piano, people sort of leave you alone as far as your private life to a certain extent. And then he said, maybe I should have just kept it to myself. And that really struck me like a hammer because, as I said before, I was a bit of a ruffian, and I put a lot of gray hairs on my late mother's head, but she never stopped loving me. And so I couldn't understand what it felt like to not have unconditional love from people that are supposed to love you unconditionally. And so that's sort of where the two things that came together to create the book.
We'll come back to that revenge and redemption as well in just a little bit. Vera?
Never Saw Me Coming is about an incoming college freshman named Chloe, who is very intelligent, and she is a diagnosed psychopath. She's entering a special program at a university in D.C. where 7 diagnosed psychopaths who are undergraduates get to go to school for free in exchange for being in this study where they're essentially contributing to the science of understanding the mind of a psychopath. But the real reason she is there is to hunt down a boy from her past who wronged her and kill him within 60 days. And then what she doesn't know is that there's someone on campus who's hunting down the psychopaths in the program one by one. The impetus for the book, I think, was kind of a combination of two things. One was that I had been reading a lot of thrillers where I felt like the female lead was sort of like a wet dish rag, like married to a mysterious man, and she doesn't ask him probing questions like, where were you last night? No, really, where were you? The way that me or my friends would. So I wanted to write a character that was like a lot more agentic and smart. And then secondly, I had kind of heard about programs for the treatment of psychopaths before, and I just found that like a really interesting idea of like, what if there was a school full of them? And I thought a school was a bit much. So I changed it to like 7 people in one panel study.
Now, I'm going to do a little follow-up here as well. Obviously, as I said in the bio, you have a PhD in social psychology. Yeah. Was that part of the impetus? Was that interest something that drove you, or was that...
Not exactly, because I'd always been interested in true crime. And in the process of that, you kind of come across this type of stuff. My background in psychology helped more with understanding how a psychology department works and like what the relationship between the professor and grad students and RAs and that would be. And also helped me read literature about psychopathy that was written for essentially professionals rather than like the mainstream, and that helped like inform the reality of what it is like for them.
Good. I'm going to stick with you for a second with the next question, though I'm going to start with Yasmin in terms of description here. Her name is Night begins with Echo Nina killing someone. It's the 5th paragraph of the book. That's not too much of a spoiler alert because it's just the 5th paragraph, just a second. And we learned that she's Wodini, did I pronounce it? Wodini, I knew I'd mess that up. An assassin, we'll say that is a synonym. And Never Saw Me Coming has find will at the end of the 3rd paragraph, just that line, find will. We understand by the chapter's end that Chloe does plan to kill him and has a timeline for doing so. And Sean, you've already mentioned revenge and redemption. Ike and Buddy Lee and Razorblade Tears are both ex-cons. They do not seem to be the best fathers, and that's part of the guilt that's driving them. And my question, and I'm going to start with Vera. What's the challenge in having protagonists who seem, at least, at the beginning, to be doing things that maybe aren't so positive or that we might associate with villains, the desire to kill, the actual killing of somebody?
Yeah, I was actually pretty indifferent towards that. I knew that there would be some segment of readers who were just like, these people are morally reprehensible, and like some of my, Goodreads reviews say that. And like I say up front, they're psychopaths. But I mean, the thing that's kind of interesting is that most people get sort of charmed by Chloe and end up rooting for her and like wanting her to kill this boy, who really is just like a terrible person. And maybe Chloe is too, but like because you're in her head and she's also kind of charming and funny, you end up getting kind of caught up in her web. So, I mean, I think I'm not really interested in reading a book about someone that like makes the correct moral decision every single time, because that's not really like a novel. I don't think the purpose of characters is to be like, well, I want to read about someone who would be like my friend in real life. Like, no, I want to read about someone who's interesting. So I think part of my goal was to lure the reader into wanting to see the revenge plot be played out.
Yeah, I teach at Mason, as I mentioned, and a lot of my students in the creative writing program they talk about the idea, well, I want my characters to be likable. I want, and this is something that they've heard from others you want. And then they fall back on that word relatable. And there's a lot of different ways to look at this. But Chloe's got great voice and great style, and as you said, very charming in some way. I think that's one of the ways that we bring a reader in some ways. Sean, go ahead.
I think for me, with Ike and Buddy Lee, they're not the most likable characters in the beginning of the book. But to your point, I think there's a distinction between likable and relatable. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't have any children, but I helped raise my niece. And to me, if someone did something to her, I could very well see myself putting them in a wood chipper. I wouldn't have no problem with it at all. And so what I tried to do was very similar to what Vera did was, bring you into their world, bring you into their mission. The first few chapters of Razorblade Tears is really trying to articulate the grief that they're going through, the pain that they're going through, and trying to put you in that place. And so the problem is for men like Buddy Lee and Ike, they don't have very good nonviolent conflict resolution. And so for them, their language, their communication is violence. That's what they know best. That's what they're good at. And so they use that to, like I said, try to find this sort of redemption. I get bad good reviews too, that, these are terrible people. And, as Vera said, I tried to put on the book, they're going to kill people. Mm-hmm. That's a part of the plot, and so I don't, I'm not trying to woo you in here under false pretenses. And so I think by the end of the book, what I tried to do was I tried to increase their communication between the two of them. Mm-hmm. So by the end of the book, violence isn't the only way that they can communicate. Because at the beginning, they hardly talk to each other. Mm-hmm. They have these very one-sided conversations. Buddy Lee is trying to talk, and Ike doesn't really want to. And by the end of the book, they've become, if not friends, they've become acquaintances. They've become partners. And so their conversations, the conversations about race, about sexuality, about their own guilt, helps the reader kind of fall in love with them to a certain extent. And there are things that happen in the book that I get people all the time that will write me emails, and it's like, I read the last 4 chapters crying through tears, and I'm like, yeah, that's the plan. That's what, and so that's how you bring them in. You make people fall in love with these characters, even though they can be brutal. Ike especially can be. Buddy Lee gets the funny lines, but Ike gets the serious threats.
And Ike has got to wait. You talk about these people, they know how to use violence. But Ike clearly is conflicted about this. He's like, I am not going back there. What I did, I'm not. Mm-hmm. And yet then I am, but I'm not. There's that inner conflict.
And what's funny about that? My editor, when we were going through the book, she really wanted me to speed that up. And I said, no. I felt like you need to make that a conversation that he has with himself. You need to make that, like you said, a weight that he's willing to put back on. If he just jumped right into it, I think the character wouldn't be as believable or as relatable. Mm-hmm. It takes him a long time to finally say, okay, yes, I'm going to let this beast out of this cage with these fragile bars. And so I think that helps to bring the reader in to care about the character as well. Absolutely.
I think that's right. Tell your editor that we all agree. Yasmin.
Oh, I was so busy listening to them, I forgot to
Oh, yeah. It's about the idea of, we start out, in your case particularly, 5th paragraph, we've got a killing, and that is the thing we usually associate with the bad guy doing something like that. And yet this is the person who's got our heart here.
Right.
How do you manage that balance?
Well, yeah, so like Vera, I was really indifferent to it because I actually really like an unlikable character, and I like a strong female character who is unapologetic for whatever it is that she does. And so Nina is very unapologetic. This is my job, and so I take pride. I'm going to do it well, so I'm going to kill you well, and so you could leave with that. And I think what I also tried to do was make her relatable, to the reader. So she's not just someone who is just thinking about it all the time. There's lots of depth and layers to her. She's like, I like to say she's like Shrek and the Onion. She's, there are just all these layers to her that you uncover. And so because that she sees this as like a job, as something that she needs to do, and through the book you'll learn from her befores why she's doing the things that she's doing, and how she really came to be that way. And I think that is what I tried to give the reader to kind of let them understand. Maybe not necessarily to justify, because some people say you can't justify killing someone. Sometimes you can, but to give them a reason as to why, okay, this might be okay. Because I did have one of my readers, one of my critical partners, say, well, why does she have to kill? Like, how are you going to, justify her being an assassin? And I'm thinking to myself, well, I really don't need to, because, it is what it is. And I'm tired of always having, to explain and justify why we make the decisions that we make. It is what it is. And so that's really what I tried to go with for her.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to stick with you for a second, because you for the next question, you talk about learn from her befores, and also about the idea of peeling an onion. And part of this, always, and each of you are talking about this, is we get to know the characters better. Characters are changing. We discover new things about them. This one is particularly for you and for Vera, but I'm going to start with you. We're used to thrillers having shifts in point of view. It's a fairly common technique that you're going to work up to like a cliffhanger and then suddenly cut away to something else, and the reader's like, no, I want to know what's going to happen, and then they're going to keep reading to find out. And so you're both doing something a little more sophisticated in terms of point of view, in terms of the structure of this. Even at the level of whether there's a first-person narrative, an I telling the story, or whether we're talking about, seeing things through a third-person perspective. In your author's note, you explicitly talk about that decision to use first-person in one section, one strand of the book, and third-person in another, those shifts of point of view. Can you talk about that in terms of the befores?
Right, yeah, so my book is told in dual timelines from Nina's perspective as she was a 14-year-old. So Anine is 14, and those are the befores. So that tells you how she led up to what she is now. And then it's told in the after chapters, which is third person past tense, as Nina, 30-something-year-old, the assassin. In the befores, I wrote that note because I knew people would be like, the switch in tenses, it's first person present tense in the befores. They would be like, oh, the switches are a little confusing. I don't know, who's speaking or whatever. And I just kind of wanted to really lay for the reader, this is what you can expect. Because I don't want anyone to say that I didn't warn them or whatever for anything. So I try to warn them for everything. And I chose that because I felt that at 14 years old, Anine would be innocent. She doesn't know the evils of the world. She only knows her idyllic Ghanaian village of Nankankwe, and that's all she knows is her family and this beautiful place. And then evil comes in. And so at 14, she's open to the reader. She's welcoming. She doesn't mind them in her head, in her space. And so I want the reader to experience everything as she experiences everything in real time. But as she, in the afters, when we have that with her in third person, older, having experienced all these things, she's not as open anymore to the reader. She is going to be just as she is with the other characters, closed off. She's not going to, invite them in, and she's going to talk as if everything's already happened, very like monotone, compartmentalized and everything. And so that's the experience that I wanted the reader to have, that openness, and I'm inside Anine's head and I'm feeling all these things, and then, wow, Nina is holding me at an arm's length. I can't get in her head like I could with Anine. Mm-hmm. And so you feel the two different, it's like two very different people, but they are the same person, if that makes sense.
It does. And it's interesting, we think about changing the texture of different time frames. And that seems a little counterintuitive to have the past scenes in the present tense. When you talk about it, it's clear that there's, that form here has a function. Style has a reason for that. And so it's interesting, though, that you felt like you had to explain it to the reader beforehand in some way. Everybody's talking about what the Goodreads reviews might turn up, so it's interesting you being a little proactive.
Yeah. Well, see, I don't even read the Goodreads. I'm like, this is what I got, and y'all either take it or leave it. I don't, But and that's just what it is. But I did want to just kind of explain that a little, because I wanted people to enjoy it. So I just wanted you to come in knowing kind of what you have and set your mind to it.
Yeah. Good. Vera, I want to come to you. You talked about Chloe being very charming at the beginning. We
Yeah.
talked about that first-person narration and the connections that we make there. It's interesting, as we're doing that, we'll also switch and get Dr. Leonard. Leonard Wyman. I make sure I get my names right. A little bit from Dr. Leonard's point of view. Then we get Andre, and all of a sudden we realize that there is a sophisticated sort of structure there as well. This is not just a first-person narrative that's carrying us through. What was the decision there?
I'm a sort of a very old-fashioned storyteller, and I don't like when I read a mystery and I feel like the author sort of cheated for the sake of like making a plot point or like a twist. So I wanted to use the toolbox, the tools that are already in the toolbox. So like point of view is a big one. So we see Chloe in first person, and then when we see her through the eyes of her therapist, he sees her as this like, intelligent young girl. He has no idea that she's like planning murder. And then we move to Andre's point of view. This isn't really a spoiler, but he's in the psychopath program, but he's faked his way in. He's actually just not a psychopath at all. Then I was like, okay, he's seeing the other psychopaths in the program from his perspective of like, he's just, in over his head entirely. So part of the way the mystery is built is through you as a reader knowing information that the other characters don't and being really faithful to that. So when you're in one particular character and they don't know something, so when you get to the third narrator, who I won't name him or her, he's making a list of potential suspects and includes Chloe on it because, of course, he would think that. Some readers are going to think, well, maybe Chloe did do it, and I'm just playing a trick on you, which, of course, I would never do that. But I wanted to use the point of view to move the plot along, but also to show different reflections of different people and their motivations.
Yeah, good. Now, Sean, yours is a little more traditional in some way because you're not shifting from first person to third person from, in this sort of thing. But we also got, Ike's perspective, we got Buddy Lee's perspective, and then all of a sudden we've got some behind the scenes, what else is going on. Tell me a little bit about how you...
Yeah, so I wanted to give both Ike and Buddy Lee time on screen, so to speak, because I wanted to come at it from both their points of view, because I write Southern fiction, Southern rural noir fiction, and a lot, the four pillars of Southern fiction are race, class, sex, and religion. And so I wanted to kind of look at those things through both of those character's eyes, through Ike as a black man, an ex-con who's really made a good life for himself after getting out of prison. He started a business, he put his son through college with that business. And those are the things he thinks makes him a good father, because he provided. But he's not really a good father because he never accepted his son for who he was. With Buddy Lee, he's someone who doesn't understand, this conversation that he and Ike have, where he doesn't understand that he has a certain privilege. And there's a conversation where him and Ike are talking about he wants Ike's truck, and Ike's like, yeah, you can have the truck, but then you're going to get pulled over 2-3 times a month. You can have the truck, but you're not going to be able to get a loan. And so he explains his point of view, and so I wanted to give voice to both of those point of view. I think, especially when you write about the South, there is a dichotomy that exists in the communities in the South. I, as an African American man from the South, sometimes have more in common with a white person from the South than I do someone from a more metropolitan area, because we've grown up in those same environments. I always say that, I grew up in very, very disadvantaged economic circumstances. City poor and country poor are very different situations, and so sometimes there's a camaraderie in that poverty and that ideal. And so I wanted to give both of those characters voice to that. And then also, I just wanted the reader to be able to see how these two different characters handle their grief, because they're on this mission of revenge together, but they look at it in very different ways. And so I use just a pretty traditional structure, because I don't think I have the skill to pull off anything fancy. So I just stick with, here's these two guys, here's some hammers and shovels to the face. Let's keep it moving. So that's sort of where that came from.
Well, I'm going to stick with you for a sec. Talk about place. You're already bringing up that you write Southern, rural noir. You talk about the difference between, rural noir, urban noir, at many levels here. Place informs your writing in so many ways, as you've talked about before, not just here, but also in previous works and short stories and the novels before. Tell me a little bit about how place, and I'm going to take another step, because I've heard you talk about Flannery O'Connor, reading Flannery O'Connor, for example. How does Southern literature, how has that influenced you, place and literature?
Well, for me, I always say that Virginia is my heart and my home. You know, I grew up here. I was born in Virginia, this is a statement that's not original to me. Ace Atkins said this to me. He said, the South is the mother of America. You know, everything starts from the East Coast, from the South, and expands outward. And so the South can a lot of times be a microcosm of what's good in the country and what's bad in the country. And so for me, place is like another character. There's a certain atmosphere, there's a certain sensibility that comes from writing rural noir. I did a long Twitter thread a couple months ago about rural writers, and had a lot of friends of mine, Laura Hightower, Wiley Cash, Steve Weddle, a bunch of people that are Southern rural writers. And I said, what is it about rural writing that stands out? Because I know what it means to me. And Laura Hightower said this. She said, it is the connection it is the connection to the natural world that informs rural writing. Because, like, I grew up chopping wood. We had a wood stove, right? And she said something online that stuck with me. She said, chopping wood is not exercise when you're in the rural environment and you're poor. You're either going to chop this wood or you're going to die. And so that's sort of that rawness, and that goes back to Willa Cather, that goes back to Jack London. That rural idea is a through line through most rural fiction, and especially Southern fiction. And so for me, the place is paramount. Like I said, it's just another character. It informs the story, the narrative, and the plot. And so for me, I don't know if I could ever write anything outside of the South. I could try, but there's just a unique connection to the South that it means a lot to me. And so also, you brought up Flannery O'Connor and William Faulkner and other great Southern writers, Ernest J. Gaines and Alice Walker. Like I said, those four pillars are very important to Southern fiction, because there is a intersectionality in Southern fiction between race, religion, sex, etiquette, Southern hospitality, so to speak, the hypocrisy of Southern hospitality that exists. Like Malcolm X said, there's no place more divided in America than church on Sunday morning. My county, where I was born at, Matthews County, the smallest county in Virginia, 7,900 people, and there are 28 churches. And so you talk about how religion informs the community. You talk about how that informs race relation. You talk about how that informs sexual identity. You talk about how that informs class. I'll just tell a real brief story. So I was in the supermarket the other day, and two people came up to me, and they had copies of my first book, Blacktop Wasteland, and they wanted me to sign them. These are two people I went to school with, that made fun of me all through school for wearing secondhand clothes and yard sale shirts, and now they want me to sign their book. And that distinction with class, because they were wealthy, they were well-off kids, and so, it's one of those things where I signed it, but in the back of my mind, it's like life is a wheel, because here you are wanting me to sign this book for your kids. And you made fun of me for years. So I think that's the thing, that is class is very interconnected in small towns. And so for me, when you talk about Flannery O'Connor, how she said that the South is Christ haunted, and I think that is very important too. The thing I'm working on now is very much about how all those pillars interconnect. I don't go so much into religion in Razorblade, but I definitely talk about race and class and how those things interconnect and intersect, and that the difference between rich man justice and poor man justice. That's the reason Ike and Buddy Lee start their mission of revenge, because they're poor men and nobody cares about their sons. And the people that did it are probably going to get away with it unless they do something about it. And I think also I'll just say this and I'll finish up. That idea of homespun justice is something that's unique to the rural areas. I wouldn't say unique to the South, because you'll find it in Midwestern fiction. You find it in like The Devil All the Time by Donald Ray Pollock. But that idea of like, we're going to handle this ourselves, because we live out in the middle of nowhere and we don't have time to go to the police. I grew up in circumstances like that. I grew up in a place where, I grew up behind a bar. And so one time my female cousin was out there, and some guys were harassing her. And my uncle went out there with a sock full of nickels. And so, he handled that. That is something I think that is unique in so much as the way it interacts in the South. You have that in the cities, you have that in other areas, but there's this idea that we have to look out for ourselves, because, nobody's going to come out in these woods and take care of this forest. So all of that is informed in not just this book, but like you said, all my writing.
Good.
I didn't mean to ramble. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I did not reach for the gavel, not once. So, Vera, I'm gonna go to you. We'll go from one extreme to another, rural to urban, and obviously, as you mentioned already, informed by the university setting as well. How does place and maybe DC as well? I know that DC plays a role in this too.
Yeah.
How is that a part of what you?
Yeah, I've been living in DC since the 90s, and I wanted to set a book there because I think depictions of DC are frequently solely focused on politics, and people don't realize like 750,000 people live there and have nothing to do with politics. And it's often referred to as like DC is a swamp, and like actually it's like a city of people, and it's a strange city because it's, you know, it's neither north nor south. It's not a state, but it sort of is. You know, taxation without representation, and it's a small city. And a lot of depictions that I've seen of DC have shown it as like being all white when it's actually really diverse, like not just in terms of like race, but people from all around the world live there, you know, whether it's diplomats or just people, you know, down the street from you speaking another language. So I wanted to place it there, and I wanted to have like a lot of references for locals that are just not the standard like Washington Monument, White House. Like there's actually, you know, like restaurants and other places. And then I wanted this university, which is like a fake university called John Adams University, which is sort of a joke about George Washington University, which is where I got my degree. So that is a campus that is in the city for real, but still feels kind of isolated. So when you're in the campus in the book, you feel like you're in a singular location, even though it's embedded in DC. And like, there's references to these large protests occurring in the book. It's like not exactly specified, but a lot of this book was being revised during various protests having to do with the Trump administration. And this is kind of this like chaos in the background that Chloe wants to take advantage of. Like, well, if I murder someone during the chaos, no one's going to notice the little chaos that I caused. So I wanted like in some ways, I think the book is a little bit of a love note to a city that I love. And I've been happy that locals are happy with how it's been depicted.
Yeah, I'm gonna, Sean mentioned Twitter a little bit ago. You had tweeted at one point that your characters is not a millennial novel. I'm gonna get it wrong, but you said something about not millennials because you're too old to be a millennial and your characters are too young to be millennial. So, what was it like about trying to write about the college scene today?
Yeah, I mean, I went to college a long time ago, so you know, when I was growing up, we kind of just got dial-up internet when I was in high school, and now kids are like hyper online. So I had to a little bit think about what is different for them. Like someone like Chloe, who is a narcissist, would be obsessed with like Instagram. So I didn't have Instagram at the time. I had to like ask people, like, how do people use this? What exactly is Snapchat? Can you do this? Can you do that? But also some of it is like maybe not as accurate, where Andre, who's black, goes into this school which is white majority, and that was what college was like for me, where there were fewer minorities. And now like GW is like 50% minority, when back then it felt like it was like 90-10. But I kind of wanted to highlight what that experience would be like for someone like him, where he would kind of seek out other minority students. And then, you know, some of the other characters in the book are just kind of living on another planet, so they're not quite as linked in with what today's kids would be.
Well, it worked really well. I mean, I get the sense of like, it seemed real to me. I figured you were an Instagram native, so good. I'm going to move on to Yasmin, the Ghanaian village. You know, that is in terms of place, that is obviously, you know, at the core of this book. Tell me a little bit about place and the way that it informs what you...
Yeah, so I definitely wanted, just like Sean, to really, really focus on like my culture. I wanted to dispel a lot of myths that are about, you know, Ghanaians, Africans, and how they may live. There are a lot of stereotypes and perceptions of how Ghanaian people are, African people are, and I wanted to show with my characters how rich, you know, how cultured, how educated, how just like they just go for what they want, and also how family oriented and culture oriented and traditional that they are. Like they are very, very much proud of where they come from, no matter where they are or what they do, and that's what you see in the organization that I created in the tribe. And that is something, we hear that all the time. Oh, have your tribe with you and all that, but it really resonates with us because we really truly believe that we have a literal tribe, as many cultures do, and then we have the tribe of people that hold us down. And so her village is, it was a nod to my late dad's, village, which is not so much now. It's been assimilated into a bigger town and things like that. But it very much comes from, my dad's, how, he kind of grew up and how, his family was really prominent in the small village that they had. And I just always thought of, oh, if we were, back in Ghana, like, how would that be? We would be, in this really cool village, and I would be the princess of a village and all this other stuff, and that's kind of where it came from. And so that's where Nankankwe is. It's that village that I envisioned, that my dad was from, and that how he would be, and then how she would be in her, the family and things like that. And even though we don't stay in Ghana the whole time, we are international, and now we go into London and then Miami and things like that. That whole idea of, a village, the tribe is still it's a big village. It's the whole village of Africa because, they want to be united in that way. And I really wanted to just kind of move that through the whole entire story, the whole just idea of where you come from and the pride in wherever, no matter where you are. And we have, that book, Backwoods Justice, in what we do internationally.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Because there might not be people out there to take care of, Africans when things happen. And so this is a group that formulates to take care of things themselves for their people and to bring their people up.
Yeah, and this is going to segue to my next question as well. The word thriller, and I actually wrote this down, might suggest nonstop action, edge of your seat suspense, unexpected plot twists, and quick turn the page momentum, that wild ride, of course, of our panel title today. Reading each of these books, though, I found as many spots where I wanted to stop and linger, stop and feel on the one hand, but also think about what was happening or what it was bringing up, an insight, an idea, that thematic weight as much as the forward propulsion that we associate with the thriller. So that's going to be my question. And I want to start with you, since one of the themes that runs through the book, as you mentioned, is, and I'm actually quoting here, the advancement of the African people on the one hand, these positive ends, but then the means to get there, taking the law into your own hands. That's a tension that runs right through to the end of the book. Mm-hmm. My question, how do you balance that fast-moving plot with a kind of thematic thoughtfulness about things? Thoughtfulness both in terms of what's happening in the book, but also thoughtfulness that you want to deliver and let the reader engage into.
Yeah, so I'm a Pisces, and so if anyone knows
Me
Pisces,
too, happy birthday.
Hey, we are some deep thinkers, and so we're always thinking about something and like really lamenting, the woes of like the world and whatever. And so when I'm watching something, a good story to me is a story that not only keeps me like, it's fast paced and it's energized, but it's something that really gives me, like you said, to really sit and ponder and think about and be like, oh my goodness. And that's what I kind of wanted in my story. I was going through, like I said, all of these different things, and I wanted to talk about like all of these different things, but I wanted it to be presented in a way that was also fast-paced. And I remember when I wrote it, because it was like my first like real thriller, and I just wanted it to be so just badass and all that. And our friend Kelly Garrett, I was like, Kelly, do you know a guy who could read my book? And like, I need him to vouch, like, not that I care like what men think, but actually this time I care what men think. And I just need him to like, tell me that it's like a guy would read it and not be like, oh, this is a chick book or whatever, right? And so she said, yeah, I've got a friend, S.A. Cosby, and he'll read it, but like, just side note, he could be very harsh. And I'm like, that's okay, I can take it, because I taught in 7th through 12th grades, and so I could take it, or whatever. And I sent him some, and he graciously said he would read some chapters. And so he read it, and he like came back to me and was like, yeah, this is good. And he gave it, and I was like, yes. And I was just so proud, because that's what I wanted to do. I didn't want to write a book that just sounded like a girl, trying to do all these things. I wanted it to be just as entertaining for everybody. It doesn't matter the color, it doesn't matter. And so any of those different and thought-provoking things that I talk about, and I talk about a lot of stuff, family, tribes, human trafficking, like there's a lot of dark things going on in this book, and I wanted to be able to talk about like the things that you would see in like a women's fiction. So it's kind of like a genre blend, but I also wanted it to be in something that is like an action thriller suspense kind of thing. So that's what I was trying to go for, and that's why you'll have those moments where it's like heart pounding, and then those moments where you're just like, wow, and then those moments where hopefully at the end you're just like, oh my gosh,
Right.
so.
Sean's talked about bar fights, and you're talking about Kelly saying he's harsh. I always think it was a big teddy bear. So I'm learning new things here.
I'm not harsh. I'm a sea brick.
Move on to Sean. Sean, you already talked about these 4 pillars: the race, the sex, the class, the religion. Not so much religion in this, but certainly touching on a lot of those themes in Razorblade Tears and in all your fiction. So how do you manage that as well? Forward propulsion?
Yeah, I think I was very lucky, about 10 years ago, to go to a lecture that Walter Mosley did at University of William and Mary, and he said, if you're going to write a detective novel or a thriller or whatever, you have to come up with things that your characters are doing when they're not detecting, when they're not in the throes of the thriller. He said, because it's going to get really boring really quick. He said, I don't care how exciting you think it is. He said, he made the allusion to, it's like being on a roller coaster that's all up. There's no dips. He said you have to have dips. You have to have quiet time. And so when I started writing Razorblade, like anybody that's read or is familiar with my first major title publisher book, Blacktop Wasteland, that story is just 100 miles an hour, just straight through. It's and I did that on purpose. I wanted the story I didn't want to give the reader time to breathe. There's very few moments of contemplation in that story. Whereas this, I was wanting people to stop and think. I wanted to give both Ike and Buddy Lee time for them to think about what they're doing and how they're progressing. And I wanted the reader to have time. Because it's in the South and in the rural area, they spend a lot of time driving. Because anybody that lives in a rural area, it takes a long time to get anywhere. So I did that on purpose, though. I wanted them to be in this enclosed space in the truck, so they have to talk. They have to have difficult conversations that we're not having, honestly, in public nowadays, about race, about sexuality, about their tragic and toxic masculinity, what it means. And so those moments are important to me, because those are the moments where the message, quote unquote, of the book comes from. But you can't do that for 300 pages, because nobody wants a 300-page sermon. And so you have to offset those with, wood chippers and bombs and bush axes and stuff like that. Yeah. And so, when you do that, you create the roller coaster. And that's, to me, the basis of a thriller, which is different than a mystery. I think with Vera's book, I think that is a little more difficult to pull off, which I'm trying to do now with a book that I'm working on. And if I had hair, I'd be pulling it out. But but that's where that comes from. You want to have the ebb and the flow that hopefully keeps readers engaged and want to get to the end.
Yeah. Vera, we talk about like thematic weight, and obviously psychopathy and some of the questions about that, and the whether this study should even be going on, this group of students. What kind of themes did you find yourself working with, or was it just I want to tell an entertaining story?
I think the psychopathy thing raises an interesting question of who are the bad guys in this book, and are they the psychopaths? One of the things that's discussed is that most serial killers aren't psychopaths, which most people think that they are. I think it's really clear when you read this book that this is a book about female rage, though, more than anything else. I was very much thinking about Brock Turner and Chanel Miller and what happened there. And I was doing the first major revision of this book during the hearings for Brett Kavanaugh. And I remember at the time just going to see one of my friends, and we didn't even say hello. She just said ugh. He just made that noise, because that's just how women felt at the time. And it just felt like not only are we impotent, but people are making fun of us to our faces about rape. And that is something I wanted captured in the background of this book, where Chloe is someone that actually does something about it, whereas most of us can't. But, I think I would describe my book as more of like a fun book and like a funny book, but there's this subtext to it where there are these like underlying issues where I'm not going to give you, a lecture about how it's weird to be the brown kid in an all-white school, but that's kind of like the subtext of like some of what's going on with Andre, or like things about mental health and the study, and then the kind of female rage thing where she's very matter-of-fact about it, of like, the way that she moves about the world, manipulating people, because she never says the word patriarchy, but it totally is something that she is understanding and using to her advantage.
Certainly aware of, absolutely. I'm watching the time. I did have another question, but I want to go ahead now to Q&A. If any of the audience members have a question, I will repeat the question. If you have one, just raise your hand. Go ahead.
I was just curious, Sean, both of your we'll call them your big books struck me as that would make very good screenplays. Is that any of that in the offing?
Okay, I'm going to repeat it real quick. Just, is there screenplays in the offing for Sean's books?
Yeah,
And just for the live stream, go ahead.
Both of them have been optioned for movies. And then my first novel, which was published by an independent publisher, shout out to Intrigue Publishing out of Baltimore, Maryland. Great folks, Austin Camacho. That book I just had a meeting about that being an option for a TV, limited streaming TV series.
No hot dog.
So, yeah. So I'm not involved in none of that, though, because I think it was Clint Eastwood that said a man has to know his limitations. So I don't think I'm going to write it right to screenplay, but it's very interesting and pretty cool. I got to talk to Jared Bruckheimer on a Zoom call, which was crazy.
Oh, wow.
I'll tell you a funny story about that real quick. So we're on a Zoom call, and we're talking about the rights, the option rights, how much they want to pay us, and so we're talking and talking and talking. And when you go on these Zoom calls, these producers, they tell you, they tell you your farts smell like cotton candy. And so they're trying to really get you hyped about it. And so he was on the Zoom call, but he didn't say anything for like the first 20 minutes. And then my agent was on the phone texting me, like, tell me what they say. And so we're talking back and forth. And finally, he like cleared his throat, and he was like, how much money is it going to take for us to be in business together? And so I text my agent. I was like, he wants to know how much money. So my agent texts me back, and I'm like holding the phone down, like not but looking at the screen. And he texts me back. He's like, say this number. So we said this god awful number, like this enormous number, right? He's like, say this. They'll never go for it, and then we'll negotiate down. I'm like, all right, gotcha. So I said, well, Mr. Bruckheimer, sir, it's going to take ... He's like, okay. He did not blink. I was like, oh my God. I would have asked for more if I knew you were going to do that. Jesus Christ. So that's in the offering right now. The script for Blacktop has been written. I read it. And it's weird. It's like letting somebody in your house and they cook in your kitchen.
Oh, yeah.
And but it's different and it's interesting. So I got to read it. They cut some stuff out that I liked, but they paid me too, so it's all right. But so hopefully the Razorblade is probably supposed to be starting filming this year. Oh, and I got to talk to Matthew McConaughey too.
Oh, man.
Yeah, he was at one point, I guess, interested in playing Buddy Lee. And he wanted to talk to me. And my agent set it up, but he didn't tell me who it was. He was like, just go to this link and click on it at 3 o'clock. And
Surprise.
I'm like, okay. And so I go there, and it's him. And I'm like, oh, my God, I'm so glad my wife's not here, because she would, like, push me out of the way to talk to him. So he was very nice. And then, we talked for, like, 5 minutes. And then at the end, I was like, are you going to say the thing? And he was like, what thing? I said, you know the thing. And he was like, all right.
That's funny.
All right. Vera, Yasmin, anything to add? I don't know if film people are after you. So.
I was optioned like a month after the book rights sold, and it's currently there are meetings happening right now.
Oh, good.
So we'll see.
Yeah. Yasmin?
Yeah, I was optioned as well. Actually, like a week after I got my book deal.
Oh, nice.
So and the biggest question was, how did you guys get the manuscript? Because it's not even, but yeah. So and it's just like Sean said, they do say a whole lot of things, and the Hollywood people are big Hollywood people, and they're just really big, and they say a lot of things. But it was. and you're just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe like I'm talking to you and things like that. So yeah, we did go with someone, and they are in the process of writing the screenplay now. So I'm looking forward to reading it, and just like Sean said, it's someone else cooking in the house, and so I'm just trying to see like what are they going to come up with, and try to keep quiet and just be like, thank you, okay, and just see how it is. So yeah.
Well, good luck in all cases.
Thank you.
Another question. I'm like, it's in my, right there, go ahead.
How do you come up with your titles? And do you do that collaboratively? Do you have that in mind at the beginning or not till the end? Or?
Okay, questions about titles, how you come up with those. Do you have them in mind at the beginning or at the end, collaborative? Sean, you were ready to answer, go ahead.
Well, for me, I don't know if everybody's familiar with the 87 Precinct novels.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Ed McBain. I love Ed McBain and Evan Hunter. And he said in an interview once that he starts out with a really pithy title, and then he builds a story around it. And so that's what I do. And I like putting words that are incongruous together. Mm-hmm. I kind of stole that from Quentin Tarantino. So Reservoir Dogs, Razorblade Tears, Blacktop Wasteland, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So that's where they come from. For me, and I'm superstitious, I can't start the project till I come up with a title.
Interesting.
Yeah, so if I don't have the title, I won't start it. So, which is kind of hard sometimes when you have a hard time coming up with one. So.
Yeah. It's funny, my wife, Tara Laskowski, is a writer as well, Sean, as you know. And every title that she's done, the publisher has changed it, like right toward the end. And she's like, whatever. So how about you, title?
Me, I am not like you in that way. So every book that I write, title is called Title, and I send it to the editor as Title, and then they're like, Yasmin, will you give us a title? And I said no, because I don't know. So I am the worst at titles. I didn't come up with that title. My agent actually did. Thank you, Melissa. And then even the second one, she came up with it. So they already know now, just don't ask me, because it's going to be Title or Untitled, and then that's just what we go with.
Yeah, I think my original title, which was terrible, was Dark Triad, and then I changed it to With Teeth after a Nine Inch Nails song, and then my agent said that's hard to pronounce, which is true, but there also is a famous book that came out last year called With Teeth at the same time. And then we submitted it under the name Tooth and Nail with an ampersand, and then my publisher didn't like it, so then we just brainstormed like 40 different titles. I did come up with this title, but it took a long time. Because you have to get something that implies kind of what the genre is too, so it's hard.
Yeah, it's a balance. Probably time for one more question. Or two in the back. Yep.
My question is for Mr. Cosby. I'm wondering how you see yourself in your characters and how you embed your personal narratives, your personal experiences in the characters.
Okay, the question is about how you see yourself in your characters and embed yourself in your characters. And Mr. Cosby, I also appreciated that.
Yeah,
as well.
that's my daddy. I don't think I do see myself in my characters. My characters are independent of me. There are parts of my characters that are based on things I know or things I've done. I used to say, like, my first book is a detective book, My Darkest Prayer, and I used to say that the character in that, Nathan, is me, but he's 10 times cooler. But with like Blacktop and with Razorblade, I don't think that I have that much in common with my characters, except that I come from the same place they do, and so I understand what that means. Like, there's a line in a book I wrote where there's a character talking about being really poor is being afraid of the phone ringing. Because when the phone rings, it's a bill, or somebody's in trouble, or somebody's in the hospital, and you have to decide between the light bill and buying cough medicine. And so that's something I experienced growing up. But not all my characters, there's some characters in here that have some money, and there's some characters here who are living a good life. And so, I think I do try to impart being a son of the South. One thing I'll say about that too, I had screw it. I had a publisher that rejected one of my books, right? And he said, or they said, let me rephrase, I don't believe that type of activities take place in the South. And he said, I don't think that people are interested in a Southern novel that is led by like a small minority community. And so for me, the South is not the sole provenance of like neo-Confederate apologists or a one type of person. It is a multiplicity of people. And every word I write is my attempt in ways both overt and subtle to ground that idea of the lost cause into the dirt. You know, every scrap of land that somebody today walks on that waves a Confederate flag, somebody that looks like me has bled and died and worked on it. So the South belongs to us just as much as anybody else. And so when I talk about what parts of myself that are in the book, those are the parts that are in the books. You know, to paraphrase James Baldwin, I love the South. I love growing up in the South. There's no place I'd rather be. But because I love the South, I reserve the right to criticize her because I know that she can be a better version of herself, because this ain't it.
Yasmin, you had talked about the village in the book. You talked about your father's village. I turn the same question on you. How do you see yourself and the characters in your book, or do you?
Yeah, I don't see myself in those characters necessarily, but definitely in the things, the experiences that they may have. You know, now I haven't killed anyone, okay, so I don't mean that, or any of that other stuff, but like in the relationship kind of aspect of it. So when Nina is, you know, she's got her biological family, she has found family, and so, you know, when I relocated to South Carolina, I had to find a family there who, you know, I could, you know, call my tribe or whatever. Relationships between fathers and daughters, because I really cherished the one that I had, and, you know, between sisters and things like that. And so, and even most of all, being a survivor, because though she goes through all these traumatic things, you know, the trauma isn't her story. Her story is about her surviving these things and rebuilding her life and her getting her power back. And that is something I guess I can say that was from me into the book, was because the book was me getting my power back that I felt was like taken away from all these different things, you know, that I was going through. And so she goes through these things and reclaims her power by killing people, sure, but like by finding her family, by finding another father figure to show her that there's still, you know, life after all these things, and so she's rebuilding and she's reclaiming and getting her power and things like that. So that's what you'll find, you know, of Yasmin in the book.
Okay, Vera?
I am not a psychopath, so I don't see myself in my character. I don't actually write about myself, really.
Yeah.
The one thing that is true is that people who've read the book, who know me, say like, "Oh, I can like hear you when I read this," and I think that's the humor mainly. And I think you know, jokes are great and funny, but the reality is that like when I'm approaching like the darkest content of social commentary, I often have to make jokes about it. I guess as a way of coping, but it's also like a form of aggression, I think, of you know, kind of aggressively pointing something out and or mocking it. And I think that that's like a little hint of me in there, if you know me well enough.
Good. We're down to the 2-minute mark. I want to have one last question. It's the standard last question. What is next? What's coming up next? Yasmin?
Yeah, so my book 2, which is the sequel to Her Name is Night, will be coming out September of this year, and then I am starting on the 3rd, so it's a trilogy, and so the last one will come out next year.
Good. What's the name of the second book? Or are they still working on that?
They're still working on it.
Just title.
They're still working on it. I don't know.
Okay. So seriously, they're still working on it. I was just making a joke.
Yeah, no, but it's still going to be like a play on like night and all this other stuff. But I don't know if they finalized it. But they asked me. They had the nerve. How dare they?
Sean?
I actually have a title for my story. I'm working on a Southern Gothic murder mystery called All the Sinners Bleed. It's about the small Southern town and the first black sheriff in the small town. And on the 1-year anniversary of his election, there's a school shooting and a teacher is murdered, and he's murdered by a former student. And so the sheriff finds out that the teacher, the former student, and a third mystery person were a triumvirate of serial killers. And so he decides to try to figure out who the third person is, while at the same time dealing with a far right parade that's playing for his small town. So, you know, normal family fun stuff.
A slow beginning there. Yeah. Vera, what's next for you?
I'm working on a mystery with some supernatural elements about, it's sort of an homage to Stephen King's It, about a group of kids in the 90s who witness a mass murder, which involves this like charismatic pastor at a mega church who they end up killing. And then they have to go back 20 years later because he has reappeared, even though they definitely killed him. So you need to investigate that.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been a real joy for me. I hope folks have enjoyed it as well. Please join me in thanking Yasmin, Sean, and Vera for their time.